Navigating an airport can be difficult for all of us, but what if you have a disability? But what if your airline damages your wheelchair? It's an investigation launched by Gatehouse Media, led by Jayme Fraser, who joins us now. Good to see you, Jayme.
Good morning. How are you?
Doing quite well. Good morning to you. Again, it's an investigation that you published back in October, and I'll let you right now kind of set the table and give us an overview of your story.
Yeah, so it started with me seeing a tweet about someone whose wheelchair was damaged when they were flying to another state for medical treatment, and it took weeks for them to get their wheelchair repaired, and so it really affected the trip, to say the least. And I was surprised.
Well, in that incident, what did that person do? Because that's a critical thing that happens.
They were fortunate they were traveling with a relative, and so they were able to rent a loaner chair.
Gotcha.
But it wasn't designed for them, and so it created discomfort and created health complications, limited her independence as she was, navigating a surgery, and then affected her ability to get around when she got home and was still waiting for her chair to be repaired. And reading that story, I was curious how often this happens. And it turns out that the U.S. Department of Transportation recently began tracking how often wheelchairs are damaged. They started asking airlines to report those figures in December every month. And so we looked at all the reports from January 1st through August 31st and found airlines had damaged nearly 7,000 wheelchairs or scooters. And that comes out to about 1.6% of all mobility aids brought on the planes.
So you're looking at these numbers and saying, okay, there's 8,000 incidents over an 8-month period. There's about 1,000 a month or whatever. That sounds like a lot. And then you look at the percentages. Well, it's around 1 or a little bit more percent. Maybe that's not that much. But it's critical, though, for those getting around. They have to have these mobility aids.
Yeah, so I think there are two ways to look at it, right? It seems like a small number, but we have to remember that this isn't losing baggage. You can't go to Target and replace your wheelchair for $20 like you can a t-shirt.
And to your point, even if you could replace that wheelchair, there's specialized mobility aids that are needed in a lot of these cases.
Exactly. When people get wheelchairs, it's not just, pick out the one that you like the look of. They measure your height, your weight. They depending on your posture, add supports to keep you from falling over. They, specifically measure your arms so that you can move the wheels, or they add special devices. Some people use a straw or a headrest to steer, and those are all custom fitted. And so a lot of times loaner chairs don't have those features, which can effectively equate to someone not even having a chair that functions for them, or that can actually lead to hospitalizations because it causes them pain or pressure sores or skin damage. And from talking with folks, both travelers and airline workers, a lot of these cases are preventable. And so, I think one of the people that I interviewed said if we had 29 dogs a day that were injured on airlines, there would be an uproar. But there's not a whole lot of discussion when 29 wheelchairs a day are broken, and that's a critical piece of someone's independence and health.
We're chatting with Jayme Fraser with Gatehouse Media News. By the way, you can go online to gatehousenews.com. You can see this story that she published back in October, and there's a graphic on there that you guys did a great job with on what we're talking about here. Not all chairs are the same. You have the transport, the aisle, the manual, the sport, and the power. And if you mouse over each of those images, you'll learn a little bit more about those specific chairs to kind of emphasize your point there. Credit to Jennifer Borenson with Gatehouse Media Research for the graphic there. Something you mentioned I wanted to ask you about. What have you learned about the handling of wheelchairs? Who does that, and what does that process typically, hopefully, look like?
Yeah, so there are several stages of air travel that are different for someone traveling with a mobility aid than for folks who don't. They have to get to the airport a lot earlier. Sometimes they are brought to the gate in an airport chair by a wheelchair attendant. Other times they're going to the gate in their own device. Going through security requires extra steps and inspections. But when it comes to actually getting on the plane, that's where the majority of the damage happens to these devices. Um, Usually, when you gate check a chair, a person is transferred from their personal chair into an aisle transfer chair, which is a really narrow chair that has lots of straps. People get strapped in so they're not falling over or their arms aren't hitting chairs as they're being pulled onto the plane because the aisle's too narrow for a standard chair.
For sure.
And then they're transferred from that chair into an airplane seat. And then you reverse the process when you get off the plane. So when you go down the jetway and you're moved into this aisle transfer chair, you leave your personal chair there. And at that point, someone from the baggage crew comes up and gets your chair, and either using elevators or carrying it down the stairs, brings it to the ground level where it's loaded onto the plane with luggage. And the processes for getting it down to the ground and loading it into the cargo hold vary a lot by airlines. Some airlines have, ask baggage crews, particularly with heavy power chairs that are 300 or 400 pounds, that they strap them down in the cargo hold, but not all cargo holds have hooks that allow them to be strapped down. Sometimes the chairs are too big for the holes in the plane, and so they have to tilt them sideways, which particularly for power chairs that have delicate components can mean they break. Some airlines, allow baggage handlers to stack other luggage on top of mobility aids. And as a plane's flying and things shift, you can end up with damage.
I can see where that would be challenging as well. When you valet check a bag, you see people with strollers who leave it there. There's about 800 different ways you can break down a stroller. I'm assuming a wheelchair probably also have their individual buttons and levers that must be pushed as well. And speaking of such, those valet workers, are they airline employees? Are they airport? Are they private? I guess I've always assumed they are airline employees.
So they used to be, but in the last several years, airlines have shifted to subcontracting most jobs. So usually the people on a plane, the pilots, the stewards, they are airline employees, but most people that you see in the actual airport are actually employees of a contractor that the airline has hired. And so, Delta might have a contract with one company for an airport in Atlanta and a contract with a different company for an airport in LA. And so they're not directly airline employees, but that's the way disability laws are enforced, is through the airline. So it creates an extra layer where it can be difficult to hold people accountable, but also to understand the processes.
This is good stuff. I'm learning all sorts of things. Not only you can as well by reading the report on gatehousenews.com from our Jayme Fraser, who we're chatting with here today, but then also on upcoming coverage, and that's what we want to dive into right now, Jayme, because I see on your Twitter account at Jayme K. Fraser, you've posted a survey on there. What sort of response are you hearing from people, and have you heard any additional response from the airlines or any sort of industry people?
Yeah, so I guess I'll start with the industry. When we started doing this story, I reached out to them with a detailed list of questions. I wanted to hear from them, what are the things they've found that have reduced the frequency of damage over the years. A lot of them have been tracking these numbers for much longer internally than they have been sharing them with the public. I didn't get a lot of response. Several airlines didn't even reply to any of the questions. In general, they defended their practices and said they're working to get better. They think the federal figures are complete. Some disability advocates argue that even more chairs are damaged because there's a tendency for people not to report. They don't want to deal with the hassle. They think it's quicker for them to handle those repairs on their own rather than going through the airline and fighting to get paid for that. So the response from airlines so far has been limited. I'm still trying to get in touch with them. There are disability advocates and accessibility coordinators at most airlines whose job it is to try and improve procedures. So I'm hoping as part of our ongoing reporting, we can hear more from them. I've also been talking with airline workers, who are working below the wing or at the gate to assist these passengers, and hearing directly from them, which is also something we hope to report more about. So here in a few days, we're hoping to launch a dedicated website for this project with the goal of talking more broadly about airline accessibility. This initial story was about damaged wheelchairs, but we want to look at what are the challenges of airline travel for folks with other forms of disability? How well has the Air Carrier Access Act been enforced? That's the federal law outlining civil rights for people flying. Americans with Disabilities Act does not apply to airplanes. It's kind of a weird exception. But we also want to include travel tips and advice from frequent flyers who have disabilities, because there are some things travelers can do to minimize the risk of damage, even at the same time that airlines can also be making improvements. So part of that is we launched this survey, and I've heard from about 80 people so far about their travel experiences, and I've been gathering tips and advice from them, and we'll start rolling that out, and I hope to hear from more people. I think, like you said, I learned a lot, right? This was a blind spot for me as someone who's able-bodied. I had no idea the challenges that can be faced by folks with disability just trying to get from point A to point B. And so after doing this first story, it became clear that there was more to write about. There was more room to understand how other people's experience the world.
Wheels Down is the investigation. You can read that online at gatehousenews.com. You can follow more reporting from our colleague, Jayme Fraser, on Twitter as well at Jayme K. Fraser. And Jayme, thanks for your time this morning. We certainly appreciate it. Fascinating stuff.
Yeah, thanks for talking with me.